I noticed when you were recently on the Pierce Morgan program talking with Michael Shermer that the topic of near death experiences, out of body experiences, all of that came up. And I was curious because I thought that was a fascinating back and forth, because to me, at
Mhm.
least, that's like another line of evidence that kind of sits next to what you're saying, which is like, okay, if there's a part of a person that isn't the mind, but that is normally located in a way that is basically inside of your head where your first person experience is here. But if there are some examples, and in fact, quite a bit of examples, where that center of consciousness seems to be separated from the location of the brain to where people are experiencing things from a different point of view, or getting information that they didn't get from the location where their brain was. How much weight do you put into that, or how would you, I guess, connect those dots? Because I know there's a lot of people right now who are interested in near death experiences, out of body experiences, all of that type of thing. And basically, I mean, tell me if I'm making a leap here, or if you see it the same way. But if there's a plethora of evidence and testimony and information that people are sharing would not be that would not be able to be attained if the mind and the brain were only ever located at the same location, then isn't that a really strong case that there is a part of a human being that is not just the mind?
Yes,
Or am I,
yes,
or
yes.
okay. So how
Yeah,
how would, I mean, I guess maybe, yeah.
sure. Yeah, the near-death experiences are fascinating. They can be evaluated scientifically. There actually are journals, medical journals, that specialize in near-death experiences. They're surprisingly common. There are some very good studies that suggest that about 20 million Americans either have had or will have in their lifetime some kind of near-death or out-of-body experience. So they're not nearly as rare as one thinks. I've spoken to groups of people about mind-brain things, and it's very common that several people in a group that I've spoken to will approach me after I've spoken to them and tell me about their own near-death experiences. People often don't talk about it a lot publicly because it's a very personal thing, and it's kind of ineffable. That is, they have difficulties sometimes describing it in detail, and they don't want people to think they're crazy. But a lot of people have these experiences. The most famous near-death experience, and I think the best documented, was of a woman named Pam Reynolds, who was a woman in her mid-30s who had a brain aneurysm that was very large and was going to kill her, and it needed to be repaired, but it could not be fixed while there was blood flowing through her brain. That is, that the blood flow to her brain had to be stopped, and so the aneurysm could be repaired. And she had surgery in August of 1991 in Phoenix, with a Dr. Robert Spetzler, who's a neurosurgeon there, was one of the world's experts on this. And he did an operation that he called the standstill procedure. And the standstill procedure is a procedure where it took her to the operating room, put all kinds of monitors on her body, monitoring her brain waves, her heartbeat. She was massively monitored. He put her under anesthesia. He cooled her body temperature down to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which would protect her brain when he stopped her heartbeat. He then stopped her heart. They put her on a heart-lung machine so they could control her circulation. They stopped the heart-lung machine, so there's no longer any blood flowing to her brain. And then he tipped the operating table up and drained all the blood out of her brain, and then opened up the aneurysm and fixed it. And then
Hmm.
after he fixed it, he then restarted the blood flow, restarted her heart, warmed her body back up, and she survived. She did well. So after the surgery, she told him that she watched the operation while it was happening. And he initially thought she was joking because, of course, she was brain dead, basically. And she didn't even have any blood in her brain. And, of course, she was also under surgical drape. So even if by some miracle she was able to physically see, she couldn't see through the drapes, and her eyes were taped shut. which is normal during surgery. So she then recounted to him all the conversations he had during the surgery, and she was accurate. And she told him that she went out of her body, popped up to the ceiling when her heart stopped, and then she floated over his shoulder and she watched the surgery. And she described his instruments, and she had no independent way of knowing what they looked like. And she described all the instruments. She described the music that was playing in the operating room while the surgery was going on. Described the conversations of all the people that they were having in the room. And she said that while she was watching the surgery, she saw a tunnel, the proverbial tunnel, and she said she felt like she was being drawn down the tunnel. And she went down the tunnel, and on the other end of the tunnel was this beautiful landscape, this beautiful world. And she encountered, I think it was her grandparents, it was deceased relatives. And she told them she wanted to stay there because it was so beautiful. And they told her that, she would come eventually, but now she had to go back and raise her children, that she wasn't her time yet. So she went back down the tunnel, and she said she popped back into her body at the end of the surgery. And she said it was like diving into a pool of ice water, which is true because her body temperature was 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was actually cold. So her near-death experience was very well studied and very well monitored, because while all this was happening, they actually proved that she had no brain waves, she had no blood flow to her brain. It's impossible for her to have seen any of this while she was in her mind, and while she was in her body and in her brain. So there have been many reports of near-death experiences in the medical literature, certainly in the high hundreds. I think it's probably several thousand, actually. And many of them are what are called veridical, meaning, like Pam Reynolds, they can be checked. That is, that people have experiences that can be confirmed. So when I'm discussing or debating this with people who deny the reality of near-death experiences, I challenge them. And I say, well, if you're going to deny the reality of near-death experiences, you have to account for four things that are characteristic of some of the experiences. You have to account for the fact that the mental processes that people have during the experiences are almost invariably very clear, very precise, which is not at all what happens when your brain is lacking blood flow or lacking oxygen. You tend to get confused. You don't get clear. People often will have a life review where they'll review the major events of their life in great clarity. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that a substantial number of near-death experiences involve out-of-body experiences where people see things and know things that they could not have known otherwise. They will know conversations that go on in the room while they're dead. They will know the readings on monitors, medical monitors in the room while they're dead. These are checkable, and there are at least hundreds of people in the medical literature who have checkable experiences that do check out. Pam Reynolds is a good example. The third thing that has to be accounted for, that I think is actually very, very fascinating, is that, to my knowledge, there's not a single near-death experience where people have reported going down the tunnel, encountering people on the other side of the tunnel who are still living. That is, everyone on the other side of the tunnel is dead. And even there are several very, very well documented examples of people who didn't know that the person was dead. They went down the tunnel, to their surprise, encountered a friend or a relative on the other end of the tunnel that they didn't know was dead, but had just died.
Wow.
And they didn't even know it. There's an example that Catherine Kubler-Ross, who wrote extensively on death and dying and near-death experiences, wrote about. She was a psychiatrist in Switzerland who would go to the emergency room and people who had been in car accidents, and she had a little girl who had a near-death experience in a car accident. And she told Kubler-Ross in the ER that she had gone down a tunnel. She had seen her, I think it was like mother and sister, but not her father and brother. As it turned out, different members of the family had been in the car accident, were taken to different hospitals. Her mother and sister had died, but her father and brother hadn't died. And she only saw the family members who had died in the accident, and she had no way of knowing that they had died and the others didn't. So that's very well documented. The fourth thing about near-death experiences that deniers have to account for is that for many people, these are really transformative experiences. They lose their fear of death. They're really different people after it happens. So people who deny the reality of near-death experiences invariably make up these theories. Well, the brain is short of oxygen. It's a misperception. It's wishful thinking. It's a hallucination. It's a seizure. If one is to scientifically deny the reality of near-death experiences, you have to account for the four things. You have to account for why they're so clear, why they can be checked, and you can find that people have out-of-body experiences that are confirmed when their brain was not working. You have to account for the fact that they only see dead people at the other end of the tunnel. And you have to account for the fact that people's lives are transformed by this. So I think at least many near-death experiences are genuine experiences of survival of the soul after death. Now, there are deeper questions that one can ask. Does that mean that you'll live forever? Or maybe the soul just goes on for another half hour and then blinks out. The near-death experiences are not eternity. The other thing that many people have noted, and it's very true, is that near-death experiences don't always conform to a Christian worldview. That is, that not everybody sees Jesus. Some people who led lives that seem rather sinful still see a beautiful, beautiful world. And there are people who have hellish near-death experiences. So we don't know about the theological implications of all this. And that's a separate question. It's a theological question. But what I can say from the scientific standpoint is that there is very clear evidence in near-death experiences that the mind, the soul, at least can exist after the brain dies. I mean, I think that's very clear.
Yeah, I like that you brought up the theological side to it as well, because I know a lot of Christians even are kind of squirmish around this topic.
Yeah.
I think it's an important topic in the context of showing that materialism is just an insufficient paradigm to explain the breadth of reality and the breadth of the human experience. And so to me, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, the things that you're describing now are extremely important in that regard. And I like what you said, though, about not necessarily building a theology out of them, in the sense that let me get your thoughts on this. The way I see those types of discrepancies. And by the way, Michael Shermer also brought up that kind of counterpoint in the Pierce Morgan thing that I just watched, earlier this morning, kind of prepping for this. And what I would say is this: is according to a biblical paradigm, there is a dimension to reality that is not physical. And inside of that realm, if you will, the supernatural realm, there are basically good guys and bad guys. There are those who are partnered with God. There are those who are in rebellion against God. And so you have this concept of spiritual warfare. And basically, there's a binary nature to that supernatural realm. The second that's what the Bible says. And the second that you introduce that, it makes sense of the weirdness of near-death experiences, in that we're introducing the ingredient, if you will, of deception. And to me, that makes perfect sense. If someone is entering into a realm that is a cosmic battle, that is of binary nature, there's good guys and bad guys, deception and truth-telling, then the fact that you get a mixed picture of what's going on and what does it all mean actually checks out from a biblical worldview.
I totally agree. The another point that one can make is that first of all, the nature of near-death experiences. I mean, people have had these experiences for thousands of years, but there's plenty of historical evidence for this. And back in the Middle Ages, near-death experiences were much more commonly negative, and they were much more commonly explicitly Christian. People would be taken on tours. Probably a lot of Dante's writing in the Inferno was based on people's experiences in near-death experiences. So the content of the experiences is variable. and even somewhat a function of the age that we're living in. The other issue with near-death experiences, which I think is very important to recognize, is that almost everybody who has them says that in some sense they're ineffable. That is, that you can't really put into words what they saw. They try to put it into words, but it's the kind of thing that you can't just explain simply like you would explain what a tree looks like in your backyard or something. This is a different experience, and people people are expressing it as best they can. If you think about it, we never, as biological human beings, have had contact with the spiritual world in quite this way. And goodness knows how we can express it in a biological reality. My co-author, Denise O'Leary, has a nice way of looking at it, which I think makes a lot of sense. And she says that near-death experiences are kind of what happens when your mind and brain disconnect. And that doesn't mean that eternity is all like that. It just means it's that little spark that happens the moment the mind disconnects from the brain. And so we don't have much of a glimpse into the afterlife with near-death experiences. What near-death experiences really tell us is that the mind is not completely dependent on the brain for its functioning, which I think is very clear from the science.